Hello everyone, in today's video we are going to discuss how to play against the Catalan opening with the black pieces, or should I say the anti-Catalan. So this video is going to be very interesting and critical if you really want to improve your chess. So I don't want to waste any further time, so let's quickly jump into the video. So we are playing with the black pieces. White starts with 1d4. We play the move knight f6, c4, e6, knight to f3. Till now all pretty standard, d5. And here there are already many ways for white to continue the position. White can play the move e3, knight to c3, c into d5, and many more. After d5, white plays the move g3. And this opening is also known as the Catalan opening. And this particular opening is considered one of the opening that gives white the slightest advantage right from the opening. So today I thought it was very critical to discuss about this particular opening. So after g3, there are many ways for black to continue the position. Black can either capture the pawn on c4, black can play the move bishop to b4 check, maybe c6, maybe b6, I'm not sure. But today we are going to play the move bishop to e7. Bishop e7, what's the idea? Bishop e7, idea is pretty simple. We are developing the bishop and our idea is to simply short castle. After bishop e7, white plays bishop g2, short castle and short castle. Till here, all pretty standard. And from here, the real game begins. After short castle, there are many ways for black to continue the position. c5, d into c4, we have c6. We are going to play the move d into c4, capturing the pawn on c4. And here, the main move for white is to continue via queen to c2. White can also continue the game by knight e5. The idea is to capture the pawn on c4. But it doesn't, it's not the best because black can easily equalize the position via knight c6. And the idea here is after knight c6, because you cannot capture the c4 pawn because the d4 pawn is double attack. So you must capture the knight. And here b into c6, bishop into c6, and here you can play the move rook to b8. And the position is like dead equal, I would say. Like for example, let's take a move like e3 trying to defend the d4 pawn. I can already play the moves like knight d5. What's the idea? I want to play the move queen d6 and trying to hit the knight. Hit the bishop. For example, knight c3, I can play the move queen d6, attacking the bishop. The bishop moves somewhere to a4, and now already bishop b7. Black is already better. So definitely you must be thinking that black is having a bad pawn structure, but in the exchange of it, you got this open b5. You are having this heavy counterplay with queen d6, bishop b7, knight to g5. And there is no poison in this position for black at all. So going back, knight e5 is not the best move, definitely. Queen to c2, the main move. After queen c2, white's idea is to simply capture the pawn on c4. After queen c2, again there are many ways for black to continue the position. Black can play the move b5. Maybe black can play the move c5 also. I'm not sure that c5 is a bad move or good move. I think it's a bad move. After queen c2, we are going to play the move a6. And now what's the idea again? After a6, my idea here is, if white tries to capture the pawn on c4, we are going to play the move c4, attacking the queen with a tempo. The queen is forced to fall back, and here we can happily develop our bishop via bishop b7, followed by knight d7, c5, and black is already pretty happy. So that's the reason after a6, white's main move is to play the move a4 in this position, stopping black from playing the move b5, and now the idea is to capture the pawn on c4. So after a4, we are going to play the move bishop to d7, developing our bishop. What's the idea? I want to put my bishop to c6, which is the best square for my bishop. After bishop d7, again I have taken two moves into consideration, which is knight to e5 and capturing the pawn on c4. First, let's try to discuss what happens if white simply captures the pawn on c4. After queen into c4, we are going to play the move bishop c6, putting the bishop at its optimum square. After bishop c6, again there are two moves for white, which is bishop f4 or bishop to g5. I thought both the moves looks pretty natural. If bishop g5, we can first develop our knight, finishing our development. All the pieces are successfully developed now. After knight b7, knight c3, and now already h6. Bishop takes, knight takes, knight to e5, let's take for example. After knight e5, we can happily trade off the bishops and play the move queen d6. And black is already very comfortable. It's an equal position. If you ask me what's the idea for black, I would say rook to d8, rook to c8, and play the move c5. And black is very comfortable in this position. So this is what happens if bishop g5. Now let's try to discuss what happens if white goes for playing the move bishop to f4. Putting a bishop at a nice square, targeting the pawn on c7. But here we can already play the move bishop to d6, exchanging the bishops, and after bishop d6, cd6. Black is already very comfortable in this position. I don't see any problem or poison in this position. Simply knight d7, rook c8, maybe queen b6. Black's pretty happy. So this is what happens if white plays the move bishop to f4. So now going back, what happens if at the place of queen into c4, white plays the move knight to e5. After knight e5, it makes sense because white is hitting the bishop on d7, and at the same time, white is also hitting the pawn on b7. So after knight to e5, we are going to play the move bishop to c6, and here knight, and here again there are two moves. One is queen into c4, and another is knight into c6. If queen into c4, again capturing the pawn, we can first trade off the bishops, and now play the move knight to d7, developing the pieces. Knight d7, my idea is pretty clear. I can maybe capture the knight over here, giving white a double pawn, or I can simply continue the game via playing the move c5. So after knight d7, white plays knight c3, and here we are going to play the move c5. As I said, after c5, my idea is to simply capture the pawn on d4, followed by capturing the knight. And black is pretty happy in this position. So the best move for white is to capture the knight. We capture the knight with the pawn, with the queen, and here after d into c5, it looks at the first glance that white is a pawn up. White is going to play the move b4. But black can simply play the move queen to c6, check, and after f3, simply capturing the pawn on c5 with the queen. It's an equal position, and black is very comfortable. I would say black is much better compared to the white because of a slightest difference, which is the pawn is on a4 rather than on a3. What's the main idea? Here, the b4 square is a very weak for white, so white can happily put his pieces on the b4 square. It is a very minor difference that can actually affect your game in the long term. So this is exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move queen into c4. Now going back, what happens if white simply captures the bishop in this position, knight into c6, and again there are two moves to continue the position. One is to play the move e3, defending the pawn on d4, and another is to simply chop off the knight on c6. If white first plays the move e3, trying to defend the pawn on d4, here we are already going to play the move knight to a5, already defending the pawn on c4 and telling to white that we are not going to give the pawn back now. After knight a5, white is again having two options. White can play the move knight d2, trying to hit the pawn on c4, or bishop to d2, attacking the knight on a5. If white first plays the move knight to d2, attacking the pawn, we can happily play the move c5. What's the idea? Usually in this type of position, when your pawn is on c7 or c2, it is usually weak. So that's the reason many of the players like to play the move c5, trying to remove your weakness. So we already strike in the center by playing the move c5. And after c5, white is again having two moves, knight into c4 or d into c5. First, let's try to discuss what happens after d into c5. After d into c5, we are simply going to play the move rook c8, not capturing the pawn for now. And after rook c8, let's take the move knight into c4, simply rook into c5, and simply attacking the knight. And after b3, I can already play the move knight takes, pawn takes, b5. And the point here is after AB, the pawn on c4 cannot move because the pawn is pinned, and I can happily capture the pawn, and I'm already a pawn up. So this is how you can continue the position if white plays the move knight into c4. So let's try to discuss what happens if white plays the move b4 in this position. After b4, the idea is pretty clear. White is also defending the pawn on c5, and at the same time also attacking the knight on a5. So here we have a special move, which is in passing, knight takes, queen takes, and here knight to d7. A very important move to be considered. After knight d7, what's my idea? In this position, a natural move looks like to capture the pawn on c5 naturally. But the point of knight d7 here is, for example, if white plays the move like queen into b7, now we can capture with the knight, The point is, we are attacking the queen and at the same time we are also defending the pawn on a6. So the position is equal. So going back, if white tries to play the move c6, we can simply capture the pawn, and after rook d1, simply playing the move queen c1, queen c7, and black is comfortable. I know that these pawns are weaknesses, but it's still, you are a pawn up, so you can give the pawn a back in the future and get activity in the exchange. The position should be roughly equal. So yeah, this is exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move c6. Now going back, what happens if at the place of d into c5, white plays the move knight into c4, capturing the pawn on c4. After knight into c4, we play the move c into d4, which is very interesting. After c into d4, white is again having two options to continue the position. White can either capture the knight, or white can simply play the move rook to d1, pinning up the pawn. If first white tries to capture the knight, we simply capture the knight back, bishop into b7, and here simply rook b8. Attacking the bishop fall back, and here rook c8, bringing more pieces into the game. And black is already pretty healthy in this position. I would say black is slightly better. And after queen e2, moving the queen, at the place of capturing the pawn, we can simply play the move bishop to c5, developing the pieces. What's the idea? If white tries to capture the pawn after bishop takes, we are the one in the driver's seat, exerting pressure on the b2 pawn. And black is very healthy, I would say. In the worst scenario, it would be a draw, but most likely, you can put maximum pressure on your opponent in this position and try to crack them in this position, and you would be having a winning position soon. So that's the reason this position is very interesting and black is better. So now going back, this is exactly what happens if white tries to capture the knight on a5. If white tries to play the move rook d1, pinning up this knight, now it's completely winning position after rook to c8, and now the knight is simply pinned up. So after b3, which is the only move, we can play the move b5, ab5, ab5, and here the knight is dead. You can't move the knight. The point here is, if you try to capture the knight in this position, thinking that the rook is defended, you can still capture the rook, because after knight takes, after knight into a5, black can happily capture the queen in this position, and black is exchange up and having a completely winning position. So this is exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move knight to d2. So now let's going back, what happens if your opponent plays the move bishop to d2? It makes sense because white is developing the bishop to attack the knight. After bishop d2, we play the move knight to b3, jumping in with the knight, attacking the rook and the bishop. And once the rook moves, we can simply play the move c5 in this position. Now what's the idea? Idea is still the same. I'm pushing my side pawn to attack in the center. And after bishop into b7, it looks like a very natural move, but it's already a bad move. After rook to a7, attacking the bishop fall back, and I can simply capture the pawn on d4 in this position. So how can white tries to continue in this position? Like, if white tries to capture the pawn on d4 in this position, I can happily play the move like rook c7, defending my pawn on c4, and now I can capture the pawn on d4 anytime, and black is having a better position in this position. Because I can capture the pawn, and I would be simply a pawn up and having a better position. So that's the reason white must play the move queen into c4, capturing the pawn, attacking the knight. But here I can simply capture the bishop, followed by d into e3, having a winning position, I would say. The knight is attacked, the knight is forced to move, and simply e into f2. Black is completely winning in this position. So this is exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move bishop to d2. Now going back, what happens if at the place of e3 in this position, white goes for playing the move bishop into c6, capturing the knight. After bishop into c6, we can happily capture the bishop, queen into c4, and here we can happily play the move queen to d5 in this position. After queen d5, my idea is pretty simple. I'm attacking the queen. And here, like, there are already many ways for white to play, but I would say, like, maybe queen c3 trying to defend the pawn. But after queen c3, I can happily play the move like rook f to d8, or maybe rook a to b8 as well. The idea is to play the move rook b3. And if you try to play a move like knight to d2, defending the b3 square, I can still play the move rook d8, putting more pressure. And after a move like e3, maybe trying to defend the pawn, simply c5. Pawn takes and simply bishop takes. And you can already sense bishop b4 is coming up, winning a piece. Black is already very comfortable in this position. So going back, if white plays a move like queen to d3. It's still a bad move after c5. The point is, after d into c5, I can happily capture the queen, pawn takes, bishop takes, and white is having two weaknesses, whereas black is having only single weaknesses. And still, black is the one on the driver's seat. Bishop to d4, rook to b8, more pressure on the b2 pawn, and black is better. So going back again, so I think a most natural response for white is to simply trade off the queens in this position, but after queen into d5, simply c into d5, and black is again simply better. What's the reason that black is better in this position? The reason here is the pawn is on a4 at the place of a3. That's a huge difference. Now, how come? Here, basically, black's idea is pretty simple. Black can happily play the move rook b8, putting the pieces onto the fourth rank, attacking the pawn, putting pressure on the a4 and the d4 pawn, followed by doubling up upon the b file, paralyzing the bishop on defending the pawn on b2, and black can even play c5 at some point, and black is already having a very interesting position and very smooth position to continue the game. So this is how you can conclude that black is completely better in this position, practical terms, and even engine agrees that black is better. So this is how you can simply respond if your opponent plays the Catalan Opening. I have given you a complete crash course on how to play against the Catalan, or I would say the Anti-Catalan Opening. If this video was helpful for you to increase your knowledge, then make sure to like the video, share this video with everyone, and make sure to subscribe to our channel if you are new to our channel. It's free for you, but it helps us to motivate to make videos like this. So I'm going to see you soon. If you want any particular video on any particular topic, just tell me in the comment box below, and I'm going to come up with that particular video. So I'm going to see you soon. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching Oneshot Chess.